Since late 2020, Western countries have witnessed an unprecedented tide of divisiveness. Public opinion on the safety of COVID vaccination has our communities polarized like nothing ever has. Popular opinion has it that COVID vaccines are remarkably safe and absolutely necessary to end the COVID-19 public health crisis. Many people take this view to extremes, demanding that COVID vaccination should be forced upon everyone, regardless of vulnerability to SARS-CoV-2. They claim that anyone lacking the most recent round of COVID vaccines deserves nothing less than being shut out of society. Critics of the COVID vaccination program can be equally passionate, arguing that the side effects of the vaccines and the existence of safer, more effective alternatives prove that the program is net harmful. Relatively few people, it would seem, have taken the middle ground. How can this be? How can society be divided so bitterly by this novel medical product? Even more puzzling, why is there no public debate on the issue? As with the validity of lockdowns and face masks, the media conspicuously portrays only one side of the controversy. Despite the glaring depth of this rift, the origins are not hard to identify. Listen to people on each side of the debate, and a few things quickly become clear. To begin with, each side gets their information from, and by inference, trusts different sources, even different types of sources. Supporters of COVID vaccination have consistently embraced perspectives from conventional, mainstream sources. This includes newspapers, television news programs, talk shows, and government statements. Legacy media and the government are their stalwarts. These individuals believe that in times of crisis, such as a global pandemic, the last thing you would want to do is question the established institutions of authority. For people skeptical of COVID vaccines or blatantly opposed to them, the situation is quite different. Information is not generally derived from the legacy media, where attacks on vaccine critics and the unvaccinated are relentless. Skeptics of COVID vaccines are no kinder towards the legacy media, accusing them of falsely reporting on the pandemic and censoring valid criticisms of the pandemic response. They also charge the media with engaging in dark propaganda and psychological warfare. Their denunciation of the journalism profession is unequivocal.
Though nearly everyone recognizes the need for facts in order to form intelligent opinions, they do not always know how to get the facts. A number of sources of information are available to us which can provide the facts we need to make decisions wisely. In this day of high-speed communication, more and more information is flowing to us through various channels. What are some of these channels or media of information? Our principal source of information about timely events is the press, the daily and weekly newspapers which report the current news of our own community and elsewhere. Radio and television newscasts contribute to the stream of facts, and weekly news magazines also help to provide us with a large and varied fund of information about past and present happenings.
So where do those with negative views of the jabs get their information? The answer is to be found in the less censored social media sites and online platforms. This includes social media apps like Telegram, Getter, and Substack, video sharing platforms like Rumble, Odyssey, and BitChute, and small alternative news media such as The Highwire or The Expose. In the face of government pressure, television networks have produced limited, unbiased reports on COVID vaccines. As compared with COVID vaccine supporters, skeptics of the shots are more likely to attain their vaccine information and their pandemic information broadly from social media and small alternative online sources. It may be noted that while vaccine skeptics are universally exposed to the mainstream sources revered by vaccine enthusiasts, the inverse does not hold. Few vaccine proponents have been exposed to the sources from which skeptics derive their information. In fact, relatively few even know such sources exist.
The facts and opinions provided by specialists or experts on a subject are usually the soundest kind of information. Specialists are generally recognized as knowing more about a subject than anyone else. But the experts often differ as to the facts and their meaning. And of course, not everyone who speaks and writes for the public is really an expert. So it is best to consult many sources of information before we form our own conclusions.
A typical COVID vaccination supporter watches popular news shows for pandemic guidance and diligently follows her government's COVID press briefings. She exhibits strong faith in the integrity of her government and corporate news sources, and characterizes people skeptical of them as mentally disturbed. Major online and print newspapers and magazines, television news and talk shows, and the radio are her trusted sources. She will even mimic the taglines and emotions of the media personalities and their ever-agreeing guests. But vaccination supporters' relationship with the mainstream media goes beyond simple information transfer. Of equal significance is the transmission of values and attitudes. The mainstream media has had a unified narrative since the beginning of the pandemic, a narrative which includes bold accusations and intense emotions. If the media has recently been expressing rage towards the unmasked, that targeted rage will be mirrored by vaccine supporters. If the media has expressed panic over a recent surge in COVID cases, vaccine supporters will likewise display panic over the surge. If commentators on television have been opining that vaccine mandates don't violate human rights, vaccine supporters will be reiterating the same opinion to all who will listen. COVID vaccine supporters get their vaccine-related information, including government statements, exclusively from the mainstream media. Additionally, their views and feelings about vaccination tend to echo those recently expressed on mainstream sources. The opinions and feelings of vaccine supporters are never out of step with the mainstream corporate media. In contrast to vaccine supporters, skeptics of COVID shots have a decidedly contemptuous relationship with the mainstream media. Skeptics and opponents of COVID vaccination frequently bemoan legacy media's presentation of the pandemic, including coverage of the vaccination campaign. They openly accuse the press and government of practicing deception and deploying mind control techniques developed by the CIA and Chinese Communist Party. Many in the skeptic community boycott the mainstream media and stay current on vaccine news through social media and alternative outlets. Skeptics often remark that censorship, falsehoods, psychological manipulation, and the lack of investigative journalism have left the mainstream press ethically bankrupt. They contend that in the present environment, independent media is better able to provide a clear picture of the pandemic.
Another important condition for democracy is enlightenment. Making information available to citizens and giving them the skill with which to judge it. As public education increases, democracy grows. In checking a community for democracy, we must find out whether it provides schools adjusted to the needs of its young people. Just being able to get books and newspapers is no guarantee of democracy. The newspapers of a real democracy meet these tests: balanced presentation of news, disclosure of source, competence of the staff. In applying these tests to newspapers, we find out, first of all, if they report both. See if the news pages contain news only, and if opinion is kept for the editorial page. Next, we see if the paper says plainly who publishes and edits it. We know which side they're on. Newspapers in a real democracy meet a third test, competence of staff. This test requires newspaper men to value accuracy and impartiality and to interpret the news skillfully for the public.
We know that people on either side of the COVID vaccine safety issue attain related information and perspectives from different types of sources. Traditional corporate news sources strongly endorse the jab, as they have masks and social distancing. Consumers of corporate news, not surprisingly, have also strongly supported these measures. Suppressed counter-mainstream sources are far more likely to criticize all aspects of the pandemic response, including the vaccination program. The followers of these obscure websites, podcasts, social media channels, and video-sharing platforms strongly oppose the COVID vaccination program. They attribute many serious side effects and deaths to the program. Some even suggest that it could be a covert depopulation campaign. It is clear that information sources are highly correlated with public opinion on COVID vaccines. The question that must be asked next is whether the sources themselves are responsible for forming public opinion. Or could the direction of causation be the inverse, with people seeking out sources that conform to their pre-existing biases? As with the initial question on sourcing information, this is also relatively easy to answer. In the case of vaccine proponents, behavior is remarkably homogeneous. The expert on their favorite television show says the injections are safe and effective, so they proclaim that the injections are safe and effective. A host of their default radio station mocks vaccine skeptics as crazy, so they also mock vaccine skeptics as crazy. Mimicry of media personalities is the norm among COVID vaccine supporters, even when it contradicts their own experiences with the drug. It can thus be deduced that the public's positive views of COVID vaccines are a product of legacy media output. And of course, one doesn't need to seek out this type of source. On the contrary, the mainstream press is hard to avoid. But what accounts for the sentiment that COVID vaccines are unsafe? The legacy media universally portrays the products as a medical marvel, carrying only minor, insignificant side effects. They present a consistent narrative that everyone must urgently take every booster injection to keep SARS-CoV-2 under control. Vaccine skepticism could not have originated with the mainstream media.
Well, that's your fourth step. Weigh the facts against the purpose and the technique.
I think I understand. To know whether propaganda is good or not, whether it's true or not, I should know the purpose, recognize the technique, get the facts, and judge the purpose and technique by the facts.
But when you want the facts about live political battle, don't come to a campaign manager.
I might do it at that, but I will also go and see your opposition.
Well, that's all right. Whenever you're tracking down propaganda, get as many different points of view as you can.
Do you know something?
What?
I think that it might be interesting to make a really serious study of propaganda.
I find it interesting, and there's plenty to study. Here I have just a few of the many books on the subject.
Skeptics favor alternative sources for pandemic-related information and openly mistrust the mainstream news. How did this proud counterculture arise? Listen to them, and it becomes apparent that they also began the lockdown era following mainstream news very closely. The following is a typical story of a vaccine skeptic. Chris had always followed the mainstream news prior to the pandemic and held a high level of trust in the medium. During the initial lockdown phase, he was glued to the television and would read everything he could related to the pandemic, invariably from mainstream sources. Around mid to late 2020, Chris came to mistrust coverage of the pandemic and sought out alternative sources for pandemic news. Search engines only produced results extolling a defined narrative, identical to that of broadcast news. After months exploring online, he found a few social media accounts that presented what seemed like more credible pandemic information and referenced insightful websites that he had not found using search engines. From that point on, Chris would consume much less corporate news. He would get all his COVID-related information from these alternative online sources. As common as Chris's story is, it is not the universal experience of COVID vaccine skeptics. A significant number of skeptics remain limited to mainstream sources. unaware of where to find uncensored information or like-minded individuals. These disillusioned men and women testify to having bad experiences with COVID injections or exhibit suspicion about their government's COVID response in general. The government is doing much more harm than good, one often hears them say.
A community rates low on an information scale when the press, radio, and other channels of communication are controlled by only a few people, and when citizens have to accept what they're told. In communities of this kind, despotism stands a good chance. See how a community trains its teachers.
Bear this in mind. Young people cannot be trusted to form their own opinions. This business about open-mindedness is nonsense. It's a waste of time trying to teach students to think for themselves. It's our job to tell them.
And when teachers put such training into practice, despotism stands a good chance. These children are being taught to accept uncritically whatever they're told. Questions are not encouraged.
How can you ask such a question? Have you got a textbook?
Yes, ma'am.
Does it say here that our law courts are always just?
Yes, ma'am.
Then how dare you question the fact? Sit down.
And so we aren't surprised when...
But it must be true. I saw it in this book right here.
And if books and newspapers and the radio are efficiently controlled, the people will read and accept exactly what the few in control want them to. Government censorship is one form of control. A newspaper which breaks a government censorship rule can be suspended.
With few exceptions, people on both sides of the vaccine safety debate waded into the pandemic, obtaining COVID-related information solely from legacy sources. However, the perception of dishonest reporting has led many people to spurn the corporate press in favor of small, independent web-based media. Personal experiences with COVID vaccines that conflict with the media's claims have played no small part in this perception. The newfound websites, blogs, social media accounts, and podcasts can be difficult to find as they have been scrubbed from the results of virtually every search engine. Mojeek may be the only search engine that remains uncensored.
That's how the book has complicated my problem. Here I have the advice of two different people, and they completely disagree.
Well, Bill, you're going to have to decide whose advice you'll take.
But how?
Have you considered each of them as an authority?
No, sir, but...
You remember the method you learned in your civics class, don't you?
Yes.
Why not apply it here? You can sit over there, and when you're through, we'll plan your courses after you've judged your authorities.
Yes, by judging his authorities, Bill can decide which one to follow. And he must judge well, for it's a vital problem, a problem all of us face from day to day.
Very few people entered the pandemic following sources that were critical of the COVID response. It is therefore evident that COVID vaccine skepticism is not simply a product of where one happened to receive one's news at the outset of COVID. Through observing jab skeptics, it becomes clear that their sentiment has arisen from one or more of the following factors: deep dissatisfaction with the government's pandemic response, mistrust of media coverage, exposure to information on COVID vaccine injuries, and direct negative experiences with COVID vaccines. This contrasts sharply with the attitudes of jab enthusiasts who unabashedly assert their faith in the government and corporate media. Popular support for COVID vaccination is a product of the mainstream media's evangelism. The majority has accepted the image of COVID vaccines portrayed by the corporate media, an image of impeccable and undeniable safety, For these believers, receiving each round of COVID shots is the defining moral test of our time. The media's promotion of COVID vaccines has been intense and relentless. It would be remiss not to ask why. Why do corporate media and tech companies aggressively push the interest of pharmaceuticals while snuffing out every hotspot of information on vaccine injury? Why won't news agencies, search engines, and social media platforms permit any data that challenges the safe and effective narrative of COVID vaccines? News programs limit their guests to those sharing a singular vaccine defensive angle. Censorship is also rife on search engines, with results limited to those extolling that angle. Social media is no better, suspending or deleting accounts for any negative sentiment expressed regarding COVID vaccines. Sharing personal experiences or scientific studies will also get an account taken down if they are damaging to the safe narrative. According to legacy media, COVID vaccines are an immaculate, faultless medical breakthrough. They defend this view militantly, insisting that all criticism of the vaccines is deliberate falsehood or misinformation, to use their favorite term. The media defends these novel pharmaceutical products with all the vigor that the devoutly religious defend their faith. Early in the vaccination program, Facebook witnessed over 100,000 people join a new COVID vaccine injury group in a matter of days. The social media giant responded by deleting the group's account under the pretext that all the shared experiences were fabricated. In 2022, another alleged COVID vaccine group sprang up on Facebook with over 250,000 members. This time, the group members did not mention the vaccine explicitly. Nevertheless, Facebook deleted the group's account, citing that the use of carrot emojis was code for COVID vaccines. Stories of censorship like these are commonplace. Nearly the entire broadcast and digital worlds have been purged of criticism of COVID vaccines. Testimonies of side effects or deaths of relatives included. Protests of vaccine mandates and other pandemic policies have also been censored. There has been coverage of a limited number of small protests. But large protests, some involving hundreds of thousands of people, have received a complete blackout by the media and big tech. Where large protests have received media attention, no footage of them has been aired, and the size of the protest have been grossly understated. And as always, every insult, slur, and accusation conceivable has been levied at the protesters.
It is also possible for newspapers and other forms of communication to be controlled by private interests.
I thought I told you to kill that story. It'll cost us a lot of advertising.
If that story goes out, I quit.
All right.
Many theorists have attempted to explain the media's conspicuous practice of only tolerating content that portrays COVID vaccines as a medical miracle. Pharma advertising revenue is one popular theory. Pharmaceuticals are large corporations and large advertisers. Perhaps vaccine censorship is an attempt by media companies to keep some of their largest advertisers happy. Another theory suggests that the media is not acting on its own accord, but it is covertly forced to promote COVID shots by the government. Publicly available information reveals that media agencies have large institutional shareholders. Two of the largest investment companies in particular, Vanguard and BlackRock, have tentacles extending throughout the industry. Each of these two firms have several $1 trillion under management. If these or other large institutional shareholders profit from COVID vaccines, they would have a motive to pressure their media holdings to promote them.
A power scale is another important yardstick of despotism. It gauges the citizens' share in making the community's decisions. Communities which concentrate decision-making in a few hands rate low on a power scale and are moving towards despotism. Like France under the Bourbon kings, one of whom said, "The state, I am the state." Today, democracy can ebb away in communities whose citizens allow power to become concentrated in the hands of bosses.
What I say goes, see? I'm the law around here.
The test of despotic power is that it can disregard the will of the people. It rules without the consent of the governed.
Not all theories about vaccine-related censorship involve media control by outside parties. According to one version of the Great Reset theory, media and tech firms are autonomous, but certain individuals and their leadership subscribe to a radical ideology. These influential men and women may be concerned about global issues, such as climate change or overpopulation, and they see universal COVID vaccination as one way to make progress on those issues. This theory proposes that the vaccination program could mitigate overpopulation by increasing mortality or decreasing fertility. Anthropomorphic climate change could be mitigated by a smaller population and control systems that severely restrict people's behavior. The theory supposes that digital vaccine passport systems exist to prototype a more comprehensive control system, one based on carbon or social credits to incentivize more environmentally friendly lifestyles. Other versions of the Great Reset theory of vaccine censorship involve power holders covertly working towards a one-world government or sovereign nations defaulting en masse. These narratives usually tie COVID vaccination policies to the development of central bank digital currencies and involve covert governmental control over the media.
You can roughly locate any community in the world somewhere along a scale running all the way from democracy to despotism. One to the democracy end, another somewhere in the middle, and a third. Let's find out about despotism. This man makes it his job to study these things.
Well, for one thing, avoid the comfortable idea that the mere form of government can of itself safeguard a nation against despotism.
What is the origin of the unshakable trust in the mainstream media held by so many? The media has been repeatedly exposed for misleading the public about the pandemic. From widely exaggerating the virulence of SARS-CoV-2 to promising that lockdowns or vaccines would promptly end the pandemic, many claims of the media are now universally known to be false. Without exception, all the media's COVID-related claims have been accompanied by defamation of anyone expressing skepticism. A peculiar practice, considering that the press agrees with many of the criticisms after a period of time. Therein lies the problem. There does not appear to be any level of dishonesty by the media which will affect its trustworthy status with the public. Since 2020, the journalism industry has ceased to practice journalism. Journalists uncritically endorse the narratives and policies of the federal government and lash out at those who do not. Gone are the days when news agencies did their own research and formed their own conclusions. Today, the corporate media act as the propaganda department for government and big pharma. Of all the reasons why people trust corporate news, not one is rational. Few people are, in fact, rational to any meaningful degree. Personal beliefs are far more likely to be based on cognitive biases than on logical reasoning. And trust in the media is no exception.
That's right. You'll find many versions of the appeal based on the common man, the man on the street, log cabin to president. Now let's look at the rest of the movie.
Yes, Mrs. Hamline is voting for Mayor Cooper. Her friends are voting for Mayor Cooper. Your friends are voting for Mayor Cooper. The people know what they want, and what they want is Mayor Cooper. Don't you be left behind. Get on board the Victory Special. Vote for Mayor Cooper and ride with him to victory.
That ending's easy to spot. It's the bandwagon.
Yes, the propaganda we've been talking about is easy to detect. But a great deal of propaganda is much more hidden, much harder to detect.
Social learning is the chief determinant of personal opinion. From observing the behavior of others, people are conditioned from a young age to follow and revere the mainstream news. Trust and respect for the mainstream media is very common, simply because people perceive that to be the unquestioned norm. Social learning is a subconscious and sub-rational process. The extent to which social norms influence us is underappreciated, and few of us take the time to seriously examine the validity of those norms. When introspection is performed and the norms don't hold up to scrutiny, we hold on to them even more tightly, telling ourselves that we erred in our analysis. Our cognitive evolution compels us to trust that the group is always right. Another source of the public's trust in corporate media stems from views on the fundamental structure of society. People widely view their society as hierarchical, with merit and intelligence dictating the fate of each individual. The most intelligent and virtuous people hold positions of power. They are the professors at our universities and the commentators on our televisions. The least intelligent and competent individuals, in contrast, can be found on the lowest rungs of society. Whether we are aware of it or not, we tend to regard the authors of newspaper articles, the reporters on television, even the talk show personalities, as the leaders of our society, individuals whose wisdom has lifted them to the top of the social pyramid. Who are we, as common folk, to doubt them or think we know better? As with social learning bias, submission to high-status persons and institutions is also part of our evolutionary makeup. Part fear of retribution and part hope for rewards, those who hold power and influence have our devotion, even at the mental level. The perceived educational value of the media is inextricably linked to the values and beliefs of its consumers. People trust those whom they relate to and agree with. Climate change, for instance, is often covered in the mainstream media. Proposed solutions, such as transitioning away from fossil fuels, are also explored. Many people believe that climate change is a very important issue. Consequently, the media's coverage of climate engenders trust and comfort among a large portion of the public. But the mainstream media does more than reflect society's values. The media instills values into us from a young age. Regarding climate change, it was the corporate media that had convinced us that climate was an important issue in the first place. The public's relationship with the media forms a loop. The media instructs the public what to believe and value through its pervasive print, digital, and broadcast mediums. The public unwittingly absorbs the narratives it has been fed and expects the media, in turn, to abide by those same narratives. The perspectives and values for which the mainstream media are venerated are invariably those that the media itself has conditioned its consumers to value. The media-public relationship is a dysfunctional cycle, one which subverts an effective learning process for either party. However, awareness of this relationship is low. It is dehumanizing for people to acknowledge that they are but glasses that media executives have filled according to their business objectives. And yet, until that is done, the public will not awaken to the fact that it has allowed profit-driven conglomerates and state-controlled broadcasters to become the programmers of their minds.
With news pouring in from all parts of the world in the stirring days in which we live, the British people read their papers more than ever. On the way to work, in train, tube, and omnibus, the news is being studied and opinions freely formed. Britons are inveterate newspaper readers in their own homes or in public libraries. The morning survey of events at home and abroad is to them almost a ritual.
The public lacks a basic awareness of what the media is and how it operates. According to common understanding, people involved in the media, from television political commentators to magazine writers, sincerely convey their personal opinions. Publicly expressed views are taken at face value. Consumers believe these views genuinely reflect the individuals expressing them, as they would for anyone they encounter in person. However, this assumption is unfounded. Individuals affiliated with large media companies rarely conform to this expectation. The dynamics of the media industry are no different than the dynamics at any workplace. Almost all organizations are managed top-down. Each employee has a supervisor who tells him what to do and how to do it. In media companies, this means that employees are told what information is to be presented as factual, what opinions they must present as their own, and what emotions they are to express.
Even as a nation, where many have become numb to this astronomical loss.
You know, this is the 10th hospital that I have been. I'm sorry.
They are actors in the most literal sense. News and talk programs are as fictional as dramas and sitcoms. Famous media personalities are no exception. News anchors and commentators are told what to say and how to say it. And like in any industry, employees face termination if they don't follow orders.
Whether or not I thought I was telling the truth, my motive being what it was, I was not being honest.
Thanks, Rose. This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so.
It isn't always easy to be honest.
Accountability is a pillar of the perceived trustworthiness of the mainstream media. According to this principle, each person is responsible for his own actions and may be subject to discipline in the case of unethical or unprofessional behavior. A newspaper reporter who is repeatedly found to make false statements, for instance, will lose the confidence of his readers and ultimately be terminated. It is therefore in the journalist's interest to be as accurate as possible in their reporting. The same holds true at the organizational level. The larger the media organization, the more it has to lose if its reporting is inaccurate. It will lose consumers to its competitors, lowering its revenue in subscriptions and advertising. The financial might of major news agencies also instills confidence in the public. CNN and the BBC, for example, have immense investigatory resources. How could these media giants produce false or misleading stories when they have so many employees to research and verify information? It seems rational to expect mistakes to be rare in the mainstream media. Just as significant as assumptions of accountability are the desires of the public. The reverence the public has for the mainstream media has a decidedly innate quality. That people desire to be instructed and molded by the media is an inescapable conclusion. Even those who have rejected the mainstream media carry this desire towards alternative sources. It is almost universal to put one's faith in the mainstream media or one of its more popular alternatives. Truth is sought from institutions and groups, rarely from within. The infantile need for a maternal, trustworthy, and caring media has led to the public projecting characteristics of trustworthiness onto the media. Despite widespread awareness of the mainstream media's failure to practice journalism, the industry has managed to hold on to its status as an esteemed and trusted institution, less because of their PR abilities than because of deep flaws in consumers' ways of thinking. Rather than basing opinion on observations, as logic would dictate, trust in the media is sustained upon assumptions and projections of trustworthiness. This cognitive failure has kept up the illusion of media integrity in the face of ample evidence to the contrary. One cannot discount the safeguarding effect that covert censorship and unified narratives have had on the media's trustworthy image. Related to social learning bias, there is a prevalent bias which predisposes people to accept views that are promoted by the institutions they respect. If you believe there to be a majority view on an issue within a respected industry, such as the news media or university system, you are likely to accept that view regardless of the underlying logic and evidence. Hence, when mainstream news outlets present a consistent narrative on an issue, a large portion of society will accept the narrative confidently and unconditionally. By coordinating a unified narrative, the corporate media has been able to exploit the public's innate respect for institutional authority to effortlessly guide public opinion. Undoubtedly, many people are not aware of the existence of censorship by media and tech companies. The single-pointed narrative on a given issue is taken as the sole truth on the subject.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
People assume there are no views of data that conflict with respective unified narratives, at least none with any credibility. Too often, when people consume the news, they project journalistic virtues of objectivity and comprehensiveness onto their sources when they may not be present. But it is the concept of imprinting that could hold the biggest clue to society's conspicuous faith in the mainstream press. Media go-tos are like religious and cultural beliefs. People grew up with them. They don't remember when they started to follow them. Moreover, few people take the time to step back and examine their merit, or contemplate if their faith in them is duly placed. So close is the corporate media to our hearts that to question it is to question ourselves. And self-inquiry is the most dreaded of undertakings.
We must never let ourselves be divided by race or color or religion, because in this country we all belong to minority groups. I was born in Hungary. You are a Mason. These are minorities. And then you belong to other minority groups too. You are a farmer. You have blue eyes. You go to the Methodist Church. Your right to belong to these minorities is a precious thing. You have a right to be what you are and say what you think, because here we have personal freedom. We have liberty. And these are not just fancy words. This is a practical and priceless way of living. But we must work at it. We must guard everyone's liberty, or we can lose our own. If we allow any minority to lose its freedom by persecution or by prejudice, we are threatening our own freedom. And this is not simply an ideal. This is good, hard common sense.
Arguably, direct government communications have had as much influence on public perceptions of COVID vaccines as the mainstream media. A wide array of means has been used to disseminate state COVID strategy. Televised press conferences, press interviews, radio and television commercials, online ads, and billboards have been used extensively. Most governments have advanced a message of vaccine deification and reacted to criticism with censorship and slander. In cultures with deep reverence for government, a large majority is submitted to their government's moral authority and abstain from questioning pandemic policies. Governments have an unparalleled ability to inundate the public with deceptive messaging and censor credible sources of information. And this is what has transpired during the pandemic. Almost all government communication in the Anglo world has aggressively endorsed COVID vaccines and claimed that reports of serious side effects and deaths are fake. We can therefore expect that those with a strong faith in their government will disregard concerns of safety.
Dr. McNally and the other men and women at the Department of Health work closely with the family doctors in Bettystown to find and isolate cases of disease. But more important, they fight to stop disease before it can start. One way they do this is by making sure that everyone gets vaccinated. A vaccination can protect you from a disease, something like a heavy coat protects you from the cold.
The press, with its synchronized selection of experts, and the government, with its revered scientific committees, are not the only institutions which yield godlike power over public opinion. Statements by esteemed medical bodies have had a deep influence on the debate over COVID vaccine safety. Many renowned healthcare organizations, including national medical associations, have unreservedly affirmed the safety of COVID vaccination. Still, other medical and scientific groups have denounced COVID vaccines as unsafe, although they tend to be smaller and less well known. Censorship has prevented the latter from communicating with the public on the issue.
It's not a product that, based on its safety, really that anyone, in my opinion, should be taking.
Despite the media's claims, there is no scientific consensus that COVID vaccines are safe. Individuals that regard their society as meritorious and hierarchical are likely to have been influenced by the proclamations of legacy medical groups. But many people now believe these organizations to be much less autonomous than previously assumed, postulating that state coercion and conflicts of interest with pharma have led them to underplay the side effects of COVID vaccines. One of the most troubling effects of the pandemic has taken root in people's ability to reason and process information. Prior to 2020, to analyze an issue entailed a three-step process: identification of the expected results of each course of action, separation of the results into positive and negative, and selection of a course of action which optimally balances positive and negative expected outcomes. It is this type of thinking that has formed the very foundation of modern society. Selecting a course of action by calculating the advantages and disadvantages of each alternative is known as cost-benefit or risk-benefit analysis. It facilitates all manners of decision-making, from what to buy at the department store to how to allocate the state budget. Such analysis is nearly always performed at some level, even if the best option is not always implemented. For example, a person may decide not to buy a new phone after a quick mental cost-benefit analysis, but go on to buy one out of impulse, or a politician may pursue a suboptimal policy to keep a major party supporter happy. But the cost-benefit calculations are always performed, even if they alone do not dictate our final choices. When the media started to report that there was a coronavirus pandemic, the rational mode of thinking, responsible for centuries of social and scientific progress, came to an abrupt halt. The ancient predilection to live according to the dictates of divine authority once again became predominant. This time, the divine authority is not literal, but the relationship is the same. Today, the government and corporate media are the gods whose devotees offer absolute submission without intellectual justification.
Here, did you see these figures?
Yes.
And these? They give you the picture.
Yes. But I'm more impressed with what this fellow says in this magazine.
Just that one man's opinion? I'll tell you what's wrong with you, Fred. You've been against building this school from the very beginning.
I have a right to my own opinion.
You didn't start out with an opinion, you started out with a prejudice.
What do you mean by that?
He means you made up your mind before you had any facts to go on. That's a prejudice. You can't form a real opinion on anything until you've got the facts and considered what they mean.
Yes, and you've allowed this prejudice to blind you to the facts all along.
Perhaps so. But I'll do my best to consider all the facts, even if I am prejudiced.
Well, you can't use the facts unless you tackle a problem with an open mind. Now, let's get this stuff organized.
The pandemic's new normal of thought has pervaded public opinion on COVID vaccines. Before the health initiative had even begun, many people had already made up their minds that the injections were extremely safe, highly effective, and critically needed. Most of these early vaccine supporters still consider the shots invaluable. They continue to assert that staying up to date with COVID vaccines is unconditionally necessary, regardless of side effects. In effect, they claim that COVID vaccines are too important to have a safety threshold.
If you're 17, you can enlist in the Air Corps Reserve. You'll be called to training soon after your 18th birthday. Men between the ages of 18 and 26 can go into training immediately. There are things to do and places to go, and the Army Air Forces will supply both to healthy, adventurous, and patriotic young men with a will to smack the enemy where it hurts the most.
Jab enthusiasts believe implicitly that the battle against SARS-CoV-2 is their generation's greatest struggle. They argue that since COVID vaccines are the best defense against this viral enemy, people should accept their risks unconditionally. They object to any comparison of vaccine benefits against their risks. Instead, Jab supporters advocate a martyr's mentality of enduring whatever it takes to win the war against COVID, from crushing lonesomeness to chronic migraines. The practice of cost-benefit analysis has been a significant factor in public opinion on COVID vaccine safety. Skeptics of the shots generally adhere to the rational pros versus cons paradigm. They have done their homework and concluded that any benefits COVID vaccines may afford do not justify their grave health risks. Many skeptics also point to studies which allegedly demonstrate that COVID vaccines increase susceptibility to COVID and other respiratory illness. COVID vaccine advocates, at least those who do not totally dismiss evidence of serious side effects, argue that any level of risk is an acceptable trade-off. At first, they contended that the vaccines would quickly end the pandemic. Now, they argue that the vaccines keep the pandemic under control. Most of these individuals have made the same claims about lockdowns and social distancing. First, they claim that the measure would end the pandemic. Then, they claim that it would keep the ongoing pandemic under control.
The restrictions and advisories have gone from don't go to Italy now to don't go to your corner bar and don't gather in groups of more than 10, all in the name of social distancing. How much of a benefit do we expect to get from social distancing?
I think there could be a very big benefit, and I will tell you why. We talk about, again, this flattening of the curve.
Vaccine supporters are never out of step with the corporate media. More recently, a growing number of COVID vaccine advocates have turned staunchly against the vaccination program, often having witnessed serious harm from the injections. It will be interesting to see how this group affects discourse on the vaccination campaign. Views on COVID vaccine safety are highly correlated with approaches towards safety evidence. COVID vaccine critics routinely consider all types of evidence: personal experience, related experiences of friends, expert opinion, data from private and state sources, and both peer-reviewed and self-published scientific studies are included in their analysis. Vaccine proponents tend to limit their safety resources to statements by government and mainstream media. Most proponents with post-vaccination health issues have denied any link to the vaccine. Advocates of COVID vaccination claim that scientific literature has proven the vaccines to be safe. But none have been able to explain why many studies indicate otherwise. Very few have even acknowledged the existence of such studies. Nor has an advocate clarified how the blistering rate of non-serious side effects is an acceptable trade-off. SARS-CoV-2 is a mild pathogen with a mortality profile similar to the flu. Natural immunity to the virus is pervasive, and there is an array of effective medical treatments. Considering these factors, the need for COVID vaccination has always been highly contested in the scientific community. Public health departments appear to have internal debate as well. As of April 2023, a growing list of national public health authorities have ceased recommending booster shots or brought their COVID vaccination program to a close. Despite the importance of such developments, they received few mentions in the mainstream media. Vaccine supporters respond homogeneously to evidence of significant side effects. They assert that the evidence is misinformation. Their universal response is applied to all forms of safety evidence, including peer-reviewed studies, official government data, and personal testimonies. Anything which conflicts with the safe and effective narrative is automatically labeled a lie and dismissed. No justifications are ever offered. The misinformation claim is defended solely through name-calling. Dangerous, crazy, anti-vaxxer, far-right, and conspiracy theorist being some of the most popular. As with all their behavior, reactions of vaccine supporters to evidence of vaccine harms mirror the mainstream media. Attention is diverted away from the evidence and onto those presenting the evidence. In the private sphere, as in the public sphere, defamation of scientists and rights activists is the closest thing there is to a discussion of COVID vaccine safety.
Whatever you work at, son, you're still a citizen with the power to vote. Living in a scientific age, we need citizens who know enough about science to make intelligent decisions about what they do. We've used science to prolong life, to increase security and happiness. But it can also be used for destruction. Are we going to use it constructively to promote peace and give the world freedom from want?
Skeptics of COVID vaccine safety have taken the opposite approach towards analyzing safety evidence. Most skeptics give no weight to statements by the government or legacy media. Instead, they consider all types of direct and indirect evidence related to the safety of COVID vaccines. This includes independent studies, all-cause mortality, opinions of experts, reports of related deaths, and data from insurance and other non-healthcare sources. Skeptics are aware that many people claim to have been harmed by the shots or lost a family member to them. The distinguishing characteristic of skeptics is the willingness to consider sources that have been omitted or defamed by the legacy media. Skeptics of the vaccination program also differ from advocates in the way they deal with counter-evidence. Rather than relying upon ridicule, skeptics offer a number of theories for the existence of studies which allegedly validate the safe and effective narrative. Pharmaceutical fraud is one common theory. Skeptics point to the industry's long history of false efficacy claims, fabrication of trial data, and concealment of information on side effects. The incentive of vaccine manufacturers to make billions of dollars in profit is frequently noted. And skeptics widely hold that censorship has prevented many studies on COVID vaccines from being published in scientific journals. Studies which show that the shots have unacceptably high rates of serious side effects. Allegedly, censorship also prevents many published safety studies from being mentioned in the media or being discoverable online. Scientists have also made these complaints. Scientists critical of COVID vaccines have claimed that their papers have been rejected by scientific journals or scrubbed from journal search engines without any cogent explanation given. They have also noted the emergence of a dubious practice in scientific papers over the past 3 years. It is common for peer-reviewed papers on COVID vaccines to conclude that the product is perfectly safe, while the data presented in the paper shows high rates of severe or serious side effects. For many researchers, the disconnect between data and conclusions within studies indicates broad corruption in the medical research and peer-reviewed journal industries.
Here, as in our general society, there are a great many customs, and we accept them. Customs of dressing. We're neat and clean. Customs of courtesy. We're thoughtful of others. What happens if we violate a custom? It isn't serious. Perhaps we simply lose a little prestige. Nevertheless, customs do control us. We make a habit of following them. And then there are moral codes, sometimes called the mores. These are society's standards about what we should and should not do. They are more deeply ingrained in us. We simply don't cheat in games. We and the society in which we live think that's the proper way. In the canteen, there's no drinking or gambling. That's in line with the moral code of this group. And what happens if we break the moral codes? Well, anyone who breaks these loses social status. He no longer belongs. He's an outcast.
The social climate may also be responsible for the paucity of studies critical of COVID vaccines. According to critics of the jab, the consequences of criticizing COVID vaccines are dire enough to keep scientists quiet on the subject. Indeed, many scientists who have presented data suggestive of COVID vaccines being unsafe have been shunned, bullied, publicly slandered, subject to bad faith lawsuits, and terminated from their jobs. Skeptics of COVID vaccines give due consideration to all types of safety evidence, and they offer a variety of reasons why there appears to be a preponderance of evidence supporting their safety. Advocates of COVID vaccines have taken a different route, entrusting the mainstream media to filter safety evidence for them, and using defamation to avoid any discussion of the vaccine safety issue.
The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
Common sense dictates that an issue should always be analyzed within its context. Nothing happens in isolation. Everything is related to something. The catastrophic effects of lockdowns on social relations, mental health, supply chains, and the economy are testament to that. It makes sense to step back and ask why COVID vaccination has been aggressively forced upon the public. Hundreds of studies testify to the safety and efficacy of early medical treatment of COVID. Post-infection immunity is robust and long-lasting in the unvaccinated. On the surface, there does not appear to be a need for universal vaccination. Most enigmatic of all is why medical treatment of COVID is illegal in many countries. What might the COVID vaccination program affect besides our health? It has reportedly generated billions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies. The airline industry has been heavily affected by vaccine mandates. Many interpersonal relationships have been adversely affected by vaccination status or differences of opinion on COVID vaccines. A large number of people have lost their jobs or been suspended from school due to mandates. Curiously, the media evades any discussion of conflict of interest, bodily autonomy, labor rights, freedom of speech, or other aspects of mandating a potent experimental drug. How COVID vaccination is placed into the big picture is associated with opinions on the program itself. People who believe their government is sincerely trying to save them from a deadly public health emergency most often view COVID vaccines as very safe, highly effective, and critically warranted. Others, who consider their government corrupt or incompetent, and the pandemic grossly exaggerated, are more likely to view the vaccines as dangerous and unnecessary. The number of people outside of these two groups is negligible. But what is the direction of these correlations? Considering that nearly all COVID vaccine enthusiasts were devoted to the government and its sincere pandemic response prior to the rollout, it appears that it is this attitude that has spawned acceptance of the injections. The causation could not be in the other direction. The vaccines have failed to deliver the fall in COVID cases that was promised, and most people experience at least mild side effects. It does not appear plausible that supporters of the government's COVID response have been turned around by being impressed with the vaccinations.
In communities which depend almost entirely on a single industry, such as a factory or mine, maintaining economic balance is a challenging problem. If this condition exists over the nation as a whole, so that the control of jobs and business opportunities is in a few hands, despotism stands a good chance.
For skeptics of COVID vaccination, causality appears to be bidirectional. Many jab skeptics have been highly suspicious of the pandemic response since the initial lockdown and have carried that cynical attitude onto the vaccines. According to a popular theory in the community, the COVID pandemic has been planned for many years as a pretext to usher in sweeping reforms. Reforms intended to benefit the rich and powerful while lowering quality of life for the general population. As popular as this theory is, it is not shared by all vaccine skeptics. A considerable number of the vaccine's detractors trusted their governments for much of the pandemic. This group supported lockdowns, social distancing, and masking. They were even enthusiastic about the injections at first. Many got vaccinated and suffered terribly from side effects, or know people who have. Others had abandoned the mainstream narrative after discovering what they believed to be credible sources on COVID vaccine injuries. Sources which had been censored by big tech and the corporate media. There is little evidence that supporters of COVID vaccination have attempted to put the vaccination program into context. At least, no context other than that which they had been fed by the legacy press. Repeated injections, they claim, are the most effective way to deal with the deadly COVID pandemic. Evidence of vaccine-related deaths and effective medications for COVID are dismissed as conspiracy. People who view COVID vaccination as unsafe have no shortage of frames in which to place the program, and many of these frames are outside the realm of conspiracy. They may center on incompetence of health authorities or pressure on politicians to be tough on COVID amidst a hysterical public. Vaccination skeptics point to the suspicious behavior of the government and media as cause for alarm on COVID vaccination. They allege these institutions have routinely misled the public since the pandemic began. The claim that one short lockdown would end the pandemic was false. The claim that COVID vaccines would end the pandemic also turned out to be false. The claim that vaccine passports would never be considered was another falsehood. With their track record on reporting, pandemic management, and human rights, skeptics reason that it would be irresponsible to trust the government and media on the safety of COVID vaccines.
Well, look, if it hadn't been for what they did in the ninth inning, we'd be okay.
Yeah, but did you see Joe out in center field?
Hi, Marcy.
Hi, Dad.
Oh, hello, Susan.
Hi, Susan Jane. What do you know? Nothing much. And did you okay if I sit down?
Sure, go ahead, sit down. Let me tell you what this guy said. It's a scream. He said every one of our team was left with it. He said, look at this southpaw. What you folks gonna have this afternoon?
Hi, Jimmy. I want a root beer. A chocolate ice cream cone, please.
That's what I want, too, a chocolate ice cream cone.
Oh, I believe I've changed my mind. I want a chocolate ice cream cone, too.
Certain psychological drivers have a profound but underappreciated effect on opinion formation. The desire to fit in, the desire for personal consistency, and fear are three such drivers which have played a major role in the public's perception of COVID vaccine safety. The desire to fit in with others, particularly those with whom you share an identity, is central to the development of behaviors and opinions. Without being aware of it, people observe others and emulate their beliefs, values, and behaviors. Psychologists refer to this as social learning. It is a process so powerful that it works equally well in a vacuum of reason. The rise of radical leftist views this century has demonstrated the strength of social learning. Radical leftism has become mainstream, despite the fact that few people who espouse such views can logically defend them. It appears that the mere observation of liberals holding extremist views has been sufficient for hundreds of millions of self-identifying liberals to adopt them. With the majority of society insistent that COVID vaccines are safe, social learning theory would suggest the safe view to have more influence than the unsafe view. Enhancing social influence further is the fact that vaccination supporters are more vocal and aggressive than their skeptical counterparts. The greater the number of people that boast a particular view, and the more confidence projected by those people, the greater the power to recruit more people into that view. Not to mention, the more power to maintain that view among existing adherents. Popular views are self-perpetuating organisms. Their size gives them sustained social influence, even in the absence of a rational foundation. The innate desire for personal consistency has also played a hand in the formation of vaccine safety opinion. People strive to be consistent over time and seek alignment between their actions and views. Social psychologists have noted that people frequently change their views to match their actions, a very peculiar trait of human beings. Someone may regard non-fiction books as important to expand one's mind, for instance, but after realizing that she rarely reads non-fiction, decide that non-fiction is actually not that important. The uncomfortable reality is that it is simply easier to change one's mind than to change one's actions. This realization can be applied to COVID injections. Many people did not want to get vaccinated, but mandates or social pressure resulted in them doing so. Once vaccinated, they convinced themselves that the injections were, in fact, both safe and necessary. As with so many issues, internal conformity closely trails external conformity. Through self-deceit, thoughts and actions remain aligned and personal agency protected.
You see? Being afraid of climbing up the wall was your warning that it was very dangerous and that you might be hurt. You showed good common sense when you paid attention to that warning, and you don't have to be ashamed of it. Being afraid was nature's way of getting you to avoid something dangerous. But now there's something else about fear that I don't think you quite understand, Billy.
What's that?
Well, sometimes when you become afraid, there isn't anything that's really dangerous. Sometimes you think things are dangerous when they're not. Sometimes you and most other people grow afraid even when they know there's nothing dangerous. Can you think of anything like that, Billy?
I know. Kathy Lewis used to be afraid of dogs, even when they were friendly.
No discussion of COVID vaccine sentiment would be complete without exploring the role of fear. Since the beginning of the alleged pandemic, fear has shaped public thought and behavior in multiple ways. As with social distancing and masking guidance, people with a greater fear of SARS-CoV-2 are more likely to comply with the government's vaccination advice. The architects of the pandemic response are aware that when emotions run high, rational thinking declines proportionately. For people with acute fear of SARS-CoV-2, both fear of becoming ill or of making others ill, rational thinking has effectively been turned off. They have become hypersuggestible to the dominant advice on how to mitigate COVID. Without full use of their mental faculties, these individuals have not been able to assess the trustworthiness of data sources or perform cost-benefit analysis. Often, pandemic fears relate more to the continuance of social distancing and masking than to the virus itself. The dystopian new normal continues to make life insufferable for many, creating desperation for a return to normality. The fear, in this case, is that without submitting to the injections, it will not be possible to live normally due to vaccine passports, vaccine quotas, or continued voluntary measures in the community. These fears of continued assaults on basic freedom have impelled many people to roll up their sleeves. And because of the need for personal consistency, many people have often abandoned their negative views of the vaccines following their first injection. Fears of illness or continuing public health restrictions affect more than behavior. Fear can be powerful enough to compel people to think and believe that which they would not otherwise. It can propel people into a sort of cognitive panic mode. The logical processes of their brains shut off, and the primordial emotion functions take over.
A community is low on a respect scale if common courtesy is withheld from large groups of people on account of their political attitudes. If people are rude to others because they think their wealth and position gives them that right, or because they don't like a man's race or his religion.
Along with other pandemic measures, people have convinced themselves that COVID vaccines are important and benign due to the action of fear. Strong emotions trump rational thinking, particularly in times of crisis. The fear of more of the pandemic is so terrifying that many people have told themselves the same story the media has told them, brainwashing themselves in a desperate attempt to allay their pandemic-related fears. Regrettably, there could be an even more prevalent and more retching fear lurking than that related to either the virus or restrictions on freedoms. COVID vaccine supporters have always treated vaccine skeptics and the unvaccinated with astonishing cruelty. An anti-vaxxer label by vaccine supporters carries the ultimate stigma, one which consistently results in people being perpetually bullied, shunned, and defamed. It has cost people their jobs and driven people to suicide. To be labeled an anti-vaxxer is to have one's life destroyed. The fear of abuse from vaccine proponents is immense, possibly greater than the fear of the virus and the pandemic response combined. The reality is that vaccination advocates are the majority, and they are hostile. That makes for a terrifying force that everyone wants to join, and no one wants to fight. Only in the movies do people stand up to bullies and villains. In reality, most people respect and appease bullies. Adherents to the safe and effective narrative have all the ingredients for societal domination. They're the majority. They own the media and government. They control what information can be accessed. They are ruthless, and they will make sure you pay a hefty price for standing up to them. Note the similarity to violent populist revolutions of the past, and how little domestic resistance they encountered. It is no surprise that so many have brainwashed themselves into believing that COVID vaccines are safe, entirely out of fear of the pro-vaccine mob.
Nature endows us at birth with three general patterns of emotional response. Rage is the response to the primary stimulus of thwarting, something interfering with our behavior or actions. Fear is the response to loud noises or loss of support. And the emotional response to love is usually the result of a show of affection or favors. And these seem to be the emotions with which we start life. Then as we grow up, many everyday things and social situations become associated with these primary stimuli, partly by a process called conditioning. And so many things and people cause us to respond emotionally. And in general, that's good, for there are many factors involved in a personality. And a balance of emotions is important to a well-rounded personality.
Fear is a powerful motivator. It compels men and women to do things that they don't want to do, and believe things that they would never otherwise believe. Fear has vastly greater influence on opinion formation than does reason. The inherent human need to be accepted by others, the desire for personal consistency, and the anguish of fear, each carry much of the responsibility for the widely held belief that COVID vaccines are safe. These insidious cognitive mechanisms may lend insight into why, for most individuals, opinions on COVID vaccines are more a matter of the heart than of the mind. Multiple factors intermix to form the public's opinions on the safety of COVID vaccines. The types of evidence taken into consideration is responsible for much of the opinion gap. How people react to perspectives and information that challenge their existing views is another important factor. And psychological factors such as fear, the desire to be consistent, and the need for interpersonal acceptance have made it difficult for many to approach the issue in a composed manner. Many people relate to the pandemic response in a religious way and base their identities around it, preventing the rational cost-benefit paradigm from being applied. This should not be unexpected. History has shown time and again that in times of great distress and uncertainty, rational thinking gives way to a more primitive, even mob-like, follow-the-leader mentality. Censorship has been instrumental in controlling the information on which people base their opinions. It is only possible to have an informed opinion on an issue if relevant information is easily accessible. Undoubtedly, broad censorship has had a decisive impact on the COVID vaccine safety debate.
There are many people like Ben, people with problems, people that we reject and ignore because we don't understand why they act as they do, and because they're different from our idea of friends. It's hard for the soft-spoken to understand the loudmouth. It's difficult to understand the shy if you're aggressive. Those who are physically attractive cannot always appreciate the loneliness of those who are not.
So what can be done to rectify the polarization of society by COVID vaccine opinion? Are we doomed to forever be divided, speaking only to those who already share our views? The answer is to lift censorship, give a voice to the injured, and create an environment in which everyone can speak freely without fear of ridicule or retribution. The campaign of fear and vilification must come to an end. For it is only possible to think clearly when fears are under control. Only through openness and respect can our fractured society come together. Only by removing the torments upon which fears are based will people be able to take back control of their minds and impartially examine where they should place their trust. The destructive social division caused by COVID vaccine sentiment is not irreconcilable. Today, as throughout history, the strength of a nation rests upon its people's capacity for rational inquiry.